evening to our viewers in Asia, and good morning in North America, and good morning to our panelists. Good morning, first of all, to Clyde Prestowitz, who is joining us from the Washington, D.C. area, and to Scott Foster, who will interview Clyde from Tokyo. And that constellation by itself is in many ways what Clyde Prestowitz has been doing for the last 30 years or so, or more, in his professional career as a trade negotiator, as a strategist, as an advisor to 4 United States presidents. He has recently written a book, which you see on the screen right now, The World Turned Upside Down, America, China, and the Struggle for Global Leadership. Get hold of the book. It's a good one. It's I got a lot of history in it, not just theory, and I very much highly recommend it. I'm Uwe Parpart. I'm the editor of Asia Times, and a little bit more background on Mr. Prestowitz. He was first involved in trade negotiations in 1982, in fact, with the first trade mission, US trade mission to China. And he later on continued that in the Reagan Administration, being a negotiator with Japan and also with South Korea. So that was well, perhaps the first time when international trade negotiations really, were in the limelight and actually made a huge difference to the relation between states. And of course, we've seen that perhaps with the same great amount of impact during the Trump administration, and whether or not to the same positive effect of what Mr. Prestowitz achieved, that remains to be seen. I want to give you a brief introduction also to Scott Foster, based in Tokyo, where he heads up Lightstream Research, an equities research firm or securities research firm. He's been in the stock analysis and for some 20, 30 years, and has a wide experience in both Korea and in Japan. So that's by way of introductions. We thank all of you to join us this evening. I'm speaking to you from Hong Kong, and this morning in the western part of the world. I'd like to just start with one question that is one of the leading questions in the book by Mr. Prestowitz, and a question that we gave our viewers, some of our viewers, a preview and the opportunity to ask a question. And one of the first questions that was asked was, the book, or in fact, there's a quote in the book saying that the US should stop trying to change China. And the viewer wants to know, why is that so, Mr. Prestowitz?
Because we can't, is the short answer. And I think a little bit longer answer is to explain that over the past 30 or 35, even 40, back to the 1980s, the underlying assumption of US policy toward China was that by opening markets, by incorporating China into the global economy, free trade would lead to not only economic liberalization in China, but also political liberalization in China. Bill Clinton has famously said about the internet that China's efforts to control the internet would be silly. He said it would be like trying to nail Jello to a wall. And Bob Zellick, former Deputy Secretary of State, made the comment that we want China to be a responsible stakeholder in the liberal, rules-based global order. And I think that it has now become clear that China doesn't want to do that, and that China is not going to adopt fully the Western ideas of free trade and economic integration, and that we can't change them. And in fact, by insisting that they change their policies or habits, that we simply antagonize the relationship. So I think we should focus much more on making ourselves competitive with China rather than trying to stop China from being China.
Okay, that's a good introduction to the debate that we are familiar with, but you also wrote that China poses the greatest threat to America since the Civil War, greater than the Soviet Union, greater than Hitler. Could you explain why something that sounds like just a difference in economic policy is actually much more serious?
Sure. I mean, let's say, first of all, Hitler, in my view, never posed a real threat to the United States. He didn't have a doctrine that was terribly attractive. He didn't have the weapons to reach the United States. His economy was no challenge at all. Soviet Union was a military challenge, but not at all an economic challenge. Whereas in the case of China, it's an economy that's essentially as big as the United States. It's technologically advanced. It has military capability to reach the United States. And I think that because of China's intertwinement with the global economy, China has the power to coerce. So, for example, let's look right now at today at what's happening between China and Australia. The Australian Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, publicly called for an investigation of the origins of the COVID vaccine. China responded by cutting off its imports from Australia of coal, of wine, of barley, and other items. China is Australia's biggest biggest export market. So China has the power to discipline Australia. And in fact, China sent a note to Australia, to the Prime Minister, a 14-point note, telling the Prime Minister of Australia that he should reflect upon these 14 points and change his behavior. China has done a similar thing with regard to Korea. You may recall that a few years ago, the Koreans built an anti-missile facility in South Korea. China objected to that. The facility was built on land owned by a company called Lotte. Lotte had big business in China. Today, Lotte has no business in China. It had 100 stores in China. They're all closed. And Lotte doesn't sell very much to China. You may recall that Liu Xiaobo, the Chinese Nobel Prize winner, was given a Nobel Prize in Norway. And suddenly Norwegian exports of salmon to China dried up. So China has the ability to use its power, its economic power, to coerce opinion and free speech and to coerce democracy around the world. And I could go on with examples, but that's, I think, the major difference between China and the Soviet Union. Now, let me add to that. I should add that the Chinese Communist Party has told us very clearly and definitely what it stands against. So, document 9 of the Chinese Communist Party Congress of 2013 says specifically that China is opposed to Western constitutional democracy. It says specifically that China is opposed to the concept of universal values. It says specifically that China is opposed to to journalism undisciplined by by Communist Party discipline. It tells us that it is fully opposed and contrary to our fundamental values. And then in its 5-year plan of 2015, Made in China 2025, China tells us its objective is to become the dominant leader in a wide variety of technologies, robotics, artificial intelligence, semiconductors, aviation, biotech, etc. So the Chinese are telling us, look, we're going to beat you guys, and we don't like what you guys stand for. And so to me, it should be very clear that we need to if we value our own values and if we don't want to be coerced, then we need to have the ability to be relatively independent.
So the Trump administration's response to this has been to try to stifle Huawei, to try to decouple from China, break supply chains, reorient supply chains. It has been aimed at stopping China. But in your book, you talk a lot about building up America. And could you talk about the relative importance of those two approaches and
Sure.
And how much, what is absolutely necessary to achieve, to prevent China from imposing its system on the West?
Sure. Well, I think that let's go back even to the kind of the midpoint of the Trump administration. There was a critical moment in 2018. Up until 2018, of course, the Trump administration had begun its kind of decoupling policy in 2016. But in 2018, the March 1 cover story of The Economist magazine said the West made the wrong bet on China. That was a huge statement. The Economist, of all the magazines in the world, The Economist had been the one that was most dedicated to globalization and free trade. Remember, The Economist was founded by Richard Cobden back in the 1850s, the great British free trader. So for The Economist to say, oops, we made the wrong bet, that was a huge statement. And in the wake of that, many analysts and negotiators began to change their perspective and their viewpoints. So I think that you're correct. The Trump administration did begin take steps in the direction of decoupling, but it wasn't just the Trump administration. It was a broader kind of movement. Secondly, I think that it's a two-pronged kind of policy. On the one hand, I think the key element is it always comes back to this issue of coercion. If you don't want to be coerced, then you have to maintain a high degree of independence. If you're dependent on China, it's very hard to avoid being coerced. So you have to operate from that basis. And on the one hand, in these very key technological areas like 5G, telecommunications, advanced semiconductors, and so forth, it's understandable that the West doesn't want to be dependent on companies like Huawei for critical technology. And so hence the move to reduce dependence on Huawei. But what hasn't happened yet, what Trump did not do, which I think is in fact more important, is to launch a revitalization program for the West. And interestingly, this is not a new idea. I mean, in the wake of Sputnik, John F. Kennedy said, let's go to the moon, and we did. In the 1980s, when the Japanese were killing Silicon Valley, the U.S. government launched Semitech, a cooperative program to strengthen U.S. Semiconductor industry. So I think that you can only go so far by trying to slow down your opponent. If you're not running faster, you ultimately won't be able to slow your opponent down. So it's, in my view, it's a two-edged sword, but I think the most important edge is to run faster.
Could you talk a bit more about your American rejuvenation program? What would that entail?
Well, I think that in some ways I go back to the experience of World War II. You know, in 1940, the U.S. Army, I think it had about 115,000 soldiers, and U.S. shipyards were turning out maybe 10 or 20 ships a year. And by the end of 1942, they were turning out thousands per year. So I think that one thing that has to be looked at is a reassessment of the particularly the high-tech industrial base. I mean, Chinese have essentially defined the playing field. They've identified the key technologies of the future. I just mentioned them: telecommunications, semiconductors, artificial intelligence, robotics, etc. Everybody knows this. China has a full-fledged program to achieve leadership and superiority in those industries. I think the West needs to put together the same kind of program. And I say the West advisedly because this is not just a United States thing. Obviously, the United States, among the Western countries, the US is the strongest technologically. But let's look at 5G telecommunications. The US doesn't have a player in 5G telecommunications, but Finland's Nokia and Sweden's Ericsson do. I would propose that there be a Western 5G consortium based on Nokia and Ericsson to match Huawei. And I would look at all of those key technologies across the board and attempt to build a cutting-edge Western free world capacity in all of them, so that the free world is in control of its own technological destiny and not in a position where it could be coerced by China.
Scott, if I may interrupt for a moment and cut in. Clyde, I have a question that, you know, in terms of your own experience as a trade negotiator in the 1980s, of course, China at that point was not a significant element in the equation, but Japan certainly was. And the situation then, in many ways, seemed to be as intractable and difficult to deal with as you know, as it is today between the United States and China. Can you tell us a bit about your experience at that time, or is it like east is east, west, and so on and so forth?
Sure. No, I mean, it was very similar in many ways. The Japanese had also identified targeted key industries, and they had very strong, comprehensive industrial policy, and they were aiming at leadership in a number of areas. U.S. industry. I mean, people don't know this, don't remember this today, but Intel, which today is one of the world's leading major semiconductor manufacturers, in 1983-84, Intel came within a hair of bankruptcy. In 1984, 100,000 people lost their jobs in Silicon Valley because the Japanese were taking over leadership in semiconductor production and semiconductor technology. And the US was losing badly to the Japanese. Now, there's two critical points that are lessons that I took away from the Japanese experience. And one of them was that we, the United States, misinterpreted what Japan was about. And our misinterpretation was kind of a prelude to the same misinterpretation of China. So to simplify this, we would go to the Japanese and we would say, okay, what kind of a country are you? And they would say, well, we're a democracy. And we would say, oh, that's just like us. Okay, we know what that is. And what kind of an economy are you? And they would say, oh, we're a capitalist market economy. Oh, okay, well, that's just like us. And so we would assume that Japan was playing the game in the same way that we were. And then what that meant was that if there were problems or complaints, if we're both playing the same game and there's a problem, there are only two explanations. Either one or side or the other is cheating, or one side or the other is just not doing its job. And we would go to the Japanese and we would say, you're cheating. And the Japanese would say, no, you're crazy. We're not cheating. You're not doing your job. Look, you put the steering wheel on the wrong side of the car. How do you expect to sell cars here with the steering wheel on the wrong side? And we would go, we say, well, wait a minute. You guys have been stealing technology in the United States. I mean, this was a Mexican standoff, and it was the same argument for whether it was peanuts or semiconductors or automobiles or whatever. It was the same argument. Finally, I said to myself, look, Japan says it's a democracy, and it is, but it's a democracy in which the bureaucracy has enormous power. The bureaucracy can give what's called administrative guidance. I once sat at lunch with Akio Morita, the founder of Sony, and he said to me, Clyde, the MITI, the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, must give, quote, strong guidance to our semiconductor producers. What did strong guidance mean? It meant that Morita, an entrepreneur, businessman, wanted his government to tell Japanese semiconductor producers to stop dumping in the US market. Well, I thought, wow. I was at that time an official in the US Commerce Department. And I thought to myself, this is so incredible. No Commerce Department official would have the power to give that kind of guidance to anybody in the United States. So, okay, it's a democracy, but it's a democracy with a bureaucracy that just has much, much more power than the US bureaucracy has. And secondly, the Japanese would say we're a market economy, and they were a market economy, but they were a market economy structured around what they called keiretsu, which were essentially large corporate groups with cross-shareholdings. So in those days, something like 80% of the shares on the Tokyo Stock Exchange never traded because they were all locked up in cross-holdings. And so, yeah, it was a market economy, but it wasn't a market economy like we were used to playing it. And so that led me to conclude, look, we're not going to be able to persuade them to be like us. They're playing football and we're playing baseball. We're playing baseball as well as we can, but we don't have pads and helmets on, and we're getting beaten up. And we need to put some pads and helmets on and understand how they're playing the game. And we did that. We put together Semitech, which was a U.S. semiconductor industry program to revitalize the U.S. semiconductor industry. Intel survived. Intel today is the world's leading semiconductor company, one of them. So I concluded in the case of Japan that you can't change them, so you have to kind of play their game, or at least take measures to offset the damage that they might do to your game. Now, you know how when a new play or a musical is developed, before you take it to Broadway, you go to Philadelphia or Boston. So if I could make an analogy in this context, in terms of trade negotiation and globalization, for the United States, Japan was Philadelphia. Now we're on Broadway with China. China is a much, much bigger deal than Japan was. much more comprehensive. Japan was an ally. We could push the Japanese around a bit because we provided their defense. We had occupied them. They were an ally. China's not an ally. We don't do their defense. It's a much bigger, tougher game. But we practiced a little bit on Japan, but we didn't practice well enough. And now we really do have to catch up and start playing a real game with China.
I guess you're talking about industrial policy. If we look at Made in China 2025, it's an upgrade of what the Japanese, the South Koreans, the Taiwanese did, what the Germans did. And the odd man out is not China. The odd man out is the United States.
Absolutely. I would say it a different way. The odd man out is the Anglo countries, the Brits, the Americans, the Canadians, and the Aussies. The Anglos have all adopted, go back to Cobden in 1840, when Britain had industrial policy from about 1450 until about 1850. And then Cobden came along and said that free trade is God's diplomacy. And he got rid of the corn laws in the UK, and the UK went free trade. And in those days, the US was mercantilist, just like China and Japan are today. But after the Second World War, the US also adopted Cobden and free trade. And it's interesting. If you pick up an economist and you turn to the last page of the magazine, there's always a page of charts showing the GDP and the trade balance, et cetera, of all the major countries. Look at the trade, the current account status. You will see that the Anglo countries, the UK, the US, Canada, Australia, sometimes you can add in India and South Africa, those countries consistently always have the biggest trade deficits. Germany, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, always have the biggest trade surpluses. You're exactly right. It's not that that the Chinese are the odd man out. It's the Anglos are the odd guys out.
And looking at the history, the British turned to free trade after they had become the strongest manufacturing power in the world. So arguably it was then in their interest to promote free trade because no one could compete with them. And the Americans abandoned protectionism and mercantilism and adopted free trade when the world was flat on its back after the war and only the United States had not been destroyed. So now we see the average tariff rate in China coming down. It's down to 6 or 7%. It's been coming down for a long time. And China just signed up for RCEP, the Asian let's call it a trade facilitation zone, because it's basically reducing regulatory hindrances to trade. Presumably that's because they see an advantage in shifting toward free trade. How can you deal with this? They're moving in the direction that presumably we want them to go, but they're still maintaining policies that are to our disadvantage.
Well, I think that the free trade discussion is a little bit passé because today the game is not trade, it's globalization. And trade is only a piece of globalization. Financial flows today far, far outweigh trade flows. Technology flows are extremely important today. You have to look at the whole picture. So, I mean, let me go back to Japan for an example. In the 1980s, Japan had very low tariffs, lower than US tariffs. And yet, outside countries somehow just couldn't sell in Japan. And why was that? Well, it was partly because the distribution systems in Japan were controlled by these keiretsu, these monopoly industrial groups. It was because the in order to sell someplace, you have to have distributors. Well, if the distributors are all locked up, it's hard to sell. And look at automobiles. Uh, Korea sells no cars in Japan today. There's no tariff on cars in Japan. US sells very few cars in Japan. There's no tariffs. Why can't they sell cars? Because they can't get dealers. And to sell cars, you got to have dealers. Now, in Japan, the dealer is not independent. So a Toyota dealer sells only Toyotas. Nissan dealer sells only Nissans. In the US, I go down into town here and I got, Bob Char's Buick, Bob Char's Honda, Bob Char's Hyundai. A dealer can sell to anybody's cars. That's a huge difference in market access. Let's look at China. China is doing all these trade deals, but honestly, these deals are not really very important. Tariffs today are not really a big issue, except in very limited circumstances. But let's talk about China has identified these made in China 2025 industries. Do you think that, let's take semiconductors, which China is desperately trying to catch up. A foreign semiconductor company is not going to be subsidized in China the way a Chinese semiconductor company is going to be subsidized. It's not going to have the same licensing ability to get licenses and so forth. If, let's take aviation, China wants to build a commercial aircraft. Interestingly, Honeywell some time ago, not Honeywell, General Electric moved its avionics division to Shanghai. Why did they do that? I mean, GE's avionics is far, far, far advanced over China's. Why don't the Chinese buy the avionics? Because China said, hey, GE, you want to sell avionics here? You got to make them here. Now, no tariffs, ostensibly free trade, but it's not free trade. So you have to look at the whole structural context to determine whether this is really an open market or the barriers are something other than tariffs.
Okay, let me cut in again for a moment. We are now at the half-hour mark, and we have a couple of interesting questions by viewers. I'll turn it back over to you, but I'll read off a couple of these questions for Mr. Prestowitz. The first one says, are the major Western democracy investing sufficiently in strategic technology, R&D, resources, especially education, STEM, is essential if there's going to be a counter to Chinese power?
If I understood the question correctly, you're saying that to counter China, the West or the US needs to have a much more robust technological development capacity.
And right? Education.
And education. Yeah. Couldn't agree more. Absolutely. Yeah. In fact, in my book, I call for a doubling of US spending on research and development. And I have a very extensive recommendation on changing our educational system and taking advantage of better advantage of the educational ability that we do have. Yeah, absolutely.
And the second question that is in the same vein and the follow-up saying, many would hold that the US has huge latent technological capacity. Why is it not mobilizing it sufficiently? Yeah. Would that not take a little bit out of the edge out of this confrontation?
Well, that is a really good and well-informed question. Whoever asked that question, I want to give them a blue medal. So it's correct. The US has this huge latent capacity, but we're not using it. Let me explain something that is not well understood typically. In the United States, major corporations are defined legally as persons with all the rights of a person, which means that corporations can make large political donations to political candidates. They, of course, are able to go to court if a corporation thinks that it's being wronged in some way. It can go to legal resources and try to get a ruling by a court. A U.S. corporation can sue in court the U.S. government and often win against the U.S. government. Um, uh, in Washington, a CEO, let's say Tim Cook, like of Apple, or Fred Smith of FedEx, or any major CEO in Washington, that person is powerful. That person has instant entree to the White House, to the Secretary of State, to Congress. That person makes political donations. That person is powerful. In Beijing, that person is on his knees. That person has no political influence. And that person is not going to take the Chinese government to court because he knows that he's not going to win in court in China against the Chinese government. Moreover, that person knows that in China, there's such a thing as the death of 1,000 cuts. And so, if you're acting in a way that Beijing doesn't like, so many things can happen. The electricity goes out. There was a faulty switch somewhere. The electricity went out. Inspection for medical inspection. I mean, all kinds of things can happen that slow you down and disadvantage you, and they're informal. They just kind of happen. So in effect, we talk about Apple as an American company. It's not. It's a Chinese company. All of these companies that are big in China, the CEOs are hostage. They testify. When they testify before the U.S. Congress, they always claim that they represent American business. No. They represent Beijing. We have a U.S.-China Council here in Washington. It's businessmen from U.S. companies who do business in China. The Business Council, it publishes studies and papers, it testifies before Congress, but that group is really strongly beholden to Beijing. So in a way, the U.S. corporate world is more committed to pursuing China's 5-year plans than it is to pursuing any U.S. 5-year plan. The second problem is that our economists for the last 50 years, Western economists, particularly Anglo economists, have opposed industrial policy. They have argued that industrial policy is just subsidization of corporations, and it's government picking winners and losers. And everybody knows that government can't pick winners and losers, and it's just wasted money. And so the combination of the economics community being against industrial policy and the corporations being captured by China makes it very difficult to actually get a coordinated U.S. free world response.
Now, one final question in that regard. One viewer asked very pointedly, and I guess asked your opinion in particular, having served 4 presidents. What are the signals you see coming out of the Biden administration? Are they going to try to do a reset in terms of American rejuvenation, or is it going to be all the same?
Well, I think it's not going to be, I think the Biden administration is not going to return to the policies of the Obama administration. I think we've crossed a big channel in that people recognize finally that China is not going to become like us. It's not going to become a responsible stakeholder in the Western system. So I think that's recognized. I think that Biden will be more diplomatic than Trump. The Biden team will speak less in a more coordinated fashion and will be less abrupt and less rough with allies. Biden has emphasized that he wants to talk to U.S. allies. And so I think there will be an attempt to coordinate with allies. But I think that the Biden team will essentially continue, perhaps in a smoother, more coordinated way, many of the policies of the Trump administration. I think that it will try to bring the EU and Japan and Australia and India into closer cooperation and coordination with the US. The one thing I fear is that there will continue to be this lingering element of trying to convince China to be like us. You have to keep in mind that, virtually all any American leader who's studied at an elite university in the US, and if you look at Biden's people, they're all from elite universities. They've all been inculcated with this Anglo laissez-faire free trade doctrine. And on top of that, I should have mentioned Wall Street. I mentioned how CEOs are captive by China. Well, Wall Street is even more captive by China. And Wall Street is important politically in the United States. So I have a fear that that there will be a tendency to satisfice and to to try to sail between Sharabdis and Dribdis, but I'm hoping that there will be a recognition, a deep recognition, that this is not only for the U.S., not only a question of how to deal with China, but I think it's also a question of how to deal with our own internal problems. If you look at the political division in the U.S., a lot of this unrest that we're seeing, in my view, can be traced to displacement. It can be traced to middle class and workers who have, because of globalization, have been displaced. Former auto workers whose jobs went to Mexico or went to Korea. Former Silicon Valley workers whose jobs went to Taiwan or Korea or Japan. And by dint of trying to reshore U.S. production, by dint of reestablishing a technological industrial base, I think that also would revitalize the U.S. economy and bring a greater peace to U.S. politics.
Scott, you want to go?
Yeah, I guess so. 2 or 3 questions have come out of that. To start with the financial system, Wall Street, of course, likes to do big underwritings for Chinese companies, but also for decades now, Wall Street has been pushing outsourcing, downgrading manufacturing, providing incentives to outsource manufacturing to other countries, not just from company to company. And on top of that, if you look at the venture capital industry, you'll see a great deal of interest in social media, software, flying taxis, whatever, and very little interest in manufacturing.
Right.
So we have not only the interests of of Wall Street, which are very clear, but also a bias against manufacturing in the venture capital community, with Elon Musk being the major exception that proves the rule. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, no, it's good, very good question. So I think that what the two things have been missed in our economic policies over the past half century. One of them is that when, excuse me, so Wall Street has a quarterly focus, quarterly earnings, short-term focus comes out of Wall Street. And corporations have begun, reward their executives with stock options, and stock options vest in a period of time, typically pretty short term. So the Wall Street emphasis is on short-term performance. If you're in a capital intensive industry, it's hard to get high returns in the short term. And hence this great temptation to put the capital stuff someplace else. And we'll just do the fancy high tech and the design, let those guys do the grunt work, and we'll make quick, high profits. Apple has done that. Most of the semiconductor companies have done that. And it's the natural result of the Wall Street short-term quarterly earnings interest. But it's also a result of something else, which is that our economists, when they calculate the benefits of free trade and globalization, they tend to assume that we will have full employment. The models are typically based on an assumption of full employment. And if they're not, they typically try to adjust for unemployment, but they adjust in terms of thinking, okay, there will be some unemployment, but it'll be temporary. So yeah, maybe an auto worker loses his job, but in a couple of years, he'll be back. And so the loss is only that 2-year period when the auto worker is making nothing or making much less than he made before. And then the other thing that's not counted at all is the cost of the loss of skills. So, when you close, let's say, a machine tool factory, making machine tools requires a lot of different skills, not necessarily university degrees, but skills. You close a factory, not only do you lose the production, but you lose the skills. And the skills are not easily regenerated. And so, because we haven't counted those losses in our models, in my view, we haven't accurately calculated the benefits and the pros and cons of globalization. Let's just look at another thing that's very simple, but amazing. Globalization requires supply chains, and supply chains depend on ships and airplanes. Ships and airplanes are huge contributors to greenhouse gases. We don't count the cost of those greenhouse gases when we do the free change globalization calculations. Well, we should. Will it be fair and honest to ourselves? We want to reduce greenhouse gases. They're costly. We shouldn't be flying around. We shouldn't be shipping around. We ought to be producing more locally, but we don't include those costs. So what I would say is, look, if we really do honest cost accounting, we look at the cost of lost skills, the cost of displacement, the cost of another element of this is that, let's say, all of our shirts are probably made in Bangladesh. So, you and I are paying, I don't know, maybe $10 or $15 less for a shirt than we would if the shirt was made domestically. So yeah, it's nice. I like to put $15 in my pocket, but that's the pleasure I get from that $15 is qualitatively far less than the pain of the seamstress who lost her job. When the U.S. auto industry takes a big hit, a city like Detroit goes from being a wonderful world-class city to being a slum. And the cost of that slum is not temporary. The cost of that slum is long running. And it's not counted when the economists do their calculation of benefit and loss. Those costs should be counted. And when you count those costs, my calculation says we're much better off doing much more production domestically and taking the longer term look. I would recommend that instead of even doing our accounting on a quarterly basis, we do it on an annual basis, get rid of the quarterly report for Wall Street, and begin thinking like the Germans and like the Japanese and like the Chinese.
Well, it would certainly make my job more interesting, being a stock analyst.
I want to make your job interesting.
Yeah, much more interesting. Seriously, to do real forecasting and real analysis instead of second guessing the traders, right? Yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned be more like Germany, be more like Japan, because if we look at the economic relationship between those countries and China, we see it's much more balanced than the relationship between America and China.
Absolutely.
And also larger. So Japan does something like 40% more trade with China than it does with the United States.
Right.
So the United States going out and telling the Japanese, don't sell to China, cut your supply chains, that's like, please commit harakiri for us. It doesn't make any sense. It seems to me the problem is in America.
Remember that the Japanese, excuse me, about a year ago did in fact implement a new program in which they subsidized companies to bring their production back to Japan. In fact, that's something I think we ought to copy the Japanese on. And when we say that Japan has more trade with China than with us, these flows get to be tricky. Japan is sending parts to China to come here. So they're counted when they go to China, they're counted as a Japanese export to China. When they come here, they're not counted as a Japanese export to the US, but it's kind of circular. But I think that the larger point is, for me at least, is this. When I go to meetings of American economists, typically they don't want to talk about manufacturing. And they're saying manufacturing is the past, and the future is high tech. It's Google and Facebook, et cetera. And then I look at Germany and I say, okay, in the U.S., manufacturing is about 9 or 10% of GDP. Germany is a high wage country. Manufacturing is 18% of GDP, twice as much as in the U.S. Japan's a high wage country, manufacturing 20% of GDP. I think it's realistic for us to be aiming for manufacturing to be 16, 17% of GDP.
Okay. Uwe, do you have other questions from listeners?
I just, maybe stepping back a little bit from the details of what goes on in a given country at this moment. If we look at the try to be forecasters at the moment, and you've been a forecaster, Clyde, and so where is this going? I mean, what if we want a win-win rather than some kind of horrendous outcome of constant and building frictions, which might even lead to military confrontation? On the positive side, where can we go? So the U.S. has to rebuild. What else has to happen? I mean, what are, in your view?
It's very, very important for other major free world countries, Germany, Japan, India. It's very important for those countries to come along with us, or I mean, they have lessons that they could teach us. But my point is, I do believe it's important that we have a coherent free world bloc that can respond to China. I mentioned 5G, and you made the point that the US has been trying to weaken Huawei, and that's true. But what we haven't done is to strengthen a Western 5G capacity. And here's Nokia and here's Ericsson, and they have the technology. So I think that we should be working with them to support and make them the world leader rather than Huawei. But I also think that we need to have a different kind of conversation with China. And I think that we need to be able to, on the one hand, we ought, in my view, we ought to stop trying to tell the Chinese to be like us. They're not going to be like us. And China is aiming to be a major world country, and it has its own idea of what the global structure should look like and how it should operate. It's very different from ours. I think we ought to make it clear to the Chinese that we are not going to try to impose anything on them, but we also are not going to accept anything being imposed upon us. And I think that there are things that we could do. Back in the Cold War with the Soviet Union, we had a lot of arrangements with the Soviets to be sure that we didn't accidentally get into trouble. So we had rules about how our ships maneuvered around each other. And we had rules about communication. I think attempting to establish with the Chinese some of the protocols that we had with the Soviets would not be a bad idea. In the South China Sea, the potential for some kind of an accident is high. And it would be good to try to reduce that kind of potential. But I think mainly it's a matter of us getting our own country properly oriented. I don't think that we should. This point I made earlier about U.S. so-called U.S. companies essentially being hostage to China, that needs to be changed. A year or so ago, when the kids in Hong Kong were demonstrating for freedom, and they were using an app from the Apple App Store to track where the Hong Kong police were, so that they could go and demonstrate someplace where the police weren't. And Beijing leaned on Tim Cook and Apple to take that app out of the App Store, and Apple did. Then in another instance, University of California, San Diego invited the Dalai Lama to come speak at the university. And the Chinese Students and Scholars Association at the university went into a big uproar to stop the Dalai Lama from coming to San Diego, University of California, San Diego. Well, we need to stop that kind of stuff. Think about the manager of the Houston Royals basketball team, and he tweeted in favor of the demonstrators in Hong Kong. And suddenly the NBA is wiped out of broadcasting its games in China. My view is we need to make it clear that we can't be pushed around and that our companies and our individuals aren't going to be subjected to that kind of censorship.
Scott, any?
Yes. One of the more interesting proposals in your book is an allied infrastructure investment program for the Philippines, which of course would be a very wise strategic move in the South China Sea. Do you think American politicians would support that?
I hope they would. It's interesting you asked that question. I just had this morning I had a question from a friend of mine in the Philippines. You know, the Philippines is suffering badly from COVID right now. And uh, they're trying to get a vaccine, and it looks like they're going to get the Chinese vaccine. And my friend sent me an email asking if the Chinese vaccine was safe. And I thought, you know, this is such a huge missed opportunity. We should be dumping vaccine in the Philippines. Philippines wants American vaccine. They don't trust the Chinese vaccine. Um, but whether you know, the American body politic will see that, I just can't say. I have friends in the incoming administration. I think some of them would be amenable to that kind of thing. We do have, I mean, Trump did establish as part of the, we have a small kind of infrastructure bank that is becoming more active. So I have some hope. Put it there, I have some hope.
Okay, and what about Taiwan? If China takes Taiwan, it will control the production of most American semiconductors. And furthermore, if they put their Communist Party representatives into the offices of the Taiwanese semiconductor companies, they'll have access to our semiconductor designs. So Taiwan is extremely important. The technology angle of the importance of Taiwan doesn't get enough attention.
It's never, yeah, you're absolutely right. It's never mentioned, and it's absolutely critical. On the one hand, if you know, she would love to bring Taiwan into the fold as he's bringing Hong Kong into the fold. It would, you know, it would certainly raise him to the level, perhaps even above the level of Mao Zedong in the Chinese pantheon. But on top of that, if he was able to bring Taiwan into the fold, yeah, he would have the world's leading semiconductor company, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corp, TSMC. He would have it. And he would have the designs of all of the major US companies like Qualcomm and NVIDIA and so forth. And and at the same time, the relative power of the US in the South China Sea is diminishing. And so I think it's a very dangerous situation. What scares me is I think that the you know the vast bulk of the American press and of the American government just don't understand. In fact, last week there was an article in the Wall Street Journal written by a journal reporter who covers the semiconductor industry. And he was talking about how Apple and Amazon are no longer going to buy their semiconductors from Intel, but they're going to make them themselves. That's not right. Apple and Amazon are not going to make their own chips. They're going to design their chips, and they're going to send them to TSMC to be made.
Yes.
Very few people understand that. And I have heard, I have heard high-level people in the U.S. government make the comment that if it looked like China was going to take over Taiwan, that the U.S. ought to bomb TSMC to prevent it from falling into the hands of the Chinese. So that's how significant TSMC is. Yeah.
Yeah, and then there's no American semiconductor industry either. That's brilliant.
So, I mean, yeah, the good news is TSMC is building a fab in Arizona, and hopefully within a year or so, TSMC will be in the U.S. But right now, yeah, it's you know, people think the U.S. semiconductor industry is king of the world, and it's not.
Okay. Uwe, how are we doing for time and questions? I don't want to deprive other people of their questions.
We are through the hour right now, and I think we've covered an enormous amount of ground. What emerges, and I do not want to try and summarize, but what emerges to me as a clear view is that, all right, first premise, to fundamentally try and change China is not a good premise for policy. The need for the United States to rejuvenate technologically in every respect is a necessary element of policy. And in between, we have to try to presumably, actually make things work without getting into a major confrontation. Does that sort of seem right to you as a summary, Clyde?
Sounds good to me.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you both. Clyde Prestowitz, a senior American statesman, and for many, many decades, since the early days of the Reagan Administration, and Scott Foster, an observer of the technology scene from a time when perhaps not Japan, but certainly Korea or Taiwan and so on, were not really players to a point where they've become major players, not only actually reaching the levels of Japan, but perhaps going beyond. We also, of course, have Scott to thank for many articles for Asia Times, and in addition to thanking everybody for attending, I'd like to urge you, since we also need to make money, to buy subscriptions to Asia Times, where you will find many, many articles, including today, a very detailed description of the status of the Chinese semiconductor industry by none other than our Scott Foster. Thank you very much, everybody, and I hereby conclude this very, very interesting.
Thanks, Clyde.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.